hope you enjoyed your food and the desserts that are still over there. I'd like to thank my two helpers, Heather and Deborah. They were at the front desk, so you met both of them. And all because of Facebook. Jan was given all these photographs of Shipley's over there, and did anybody know anybody? And I said back, I'm a descendant of the Shipleys. Show me the pictures if you can. And then she said, famous last words, she went to the DAR and she's a descendant of a Shipley. So knowing that she's the docent at the wonderful house, that I said, wouldn't you like to be our, since I'm program chair, wouldn't you like to be our program for here? And then she talked about how she dresses up, so I said, please dress up. And she brought all those pictures, she hoping that some of you might recognize some of these pictures in the photographs. So I hope you all enjoyed your meal, had your desserts, and we had up the front table her bio, so everybody, so I know you all know how to read, because she sent me your reservations. So read the bio, she's wonderful, I met her through the Odenton Genealogist, and that is a real geneal group, through the Anne Arundel County Genealogical Society. So it's like everywhere I turn, there is Jan. Thank you so much.
And we're cousins many times.
So you have the written bio, so you can read on one side, it's all about her, the other side, it's about the banner for that, how do we pronounce that house?
Benson-Hammond.
Benson-Hammond, well, close. Yeah. So videotaped with sound, so we can put this up on our website, so those who were not able to come today will be able to see it. So thank you all, the Hardcore 36, thank you all for being here. And I would like to turn this over to Jan, a wonderful person, and thank goodness for Facebook.
Hi. So thank you all for your kind invitation to speak to this group. While not yet a member, I think my husband would drop over if I joined another group. I'm really aware of how wonderful this group is. I'm a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Just recently in the Daughters of the War of 1812. Also joined the Daughters of the Confederacy because I was born in Virginia. And just will be inducted later in a few weeks to the Daughters of Union Veterans. So, gee, why not join another? Okay. So I'm happy to be able to be here today to relay some of the Shipley connections that I share personally, as well as a relationship to a place near and dear to my heart, the Benson-Hammond House in Linthicum. Have any of you ever visited the Benson-Hammond House? I see a few have, yes.
Driven past it.
Driven past. A lot of people have driven past and are like, well, gee, when are those gates open? They're open the second and the fourth Saturday of the month at special occasions. So the first immigrant, Captain Thomas Philip Benson, is my 9th great-grandfather. He came from Devon, England to Jamestown in the early 1630s. And after some years there, he had applied for a Maryland land grant and obtained property in what later became Anne Arundel County, but he moved in about 1647 to that area. His daughter Anne married their neighbor, Colonel Nicholas Gasaway, another good Anne Arundel County name, and that cemented their connection to our county. Now the Thomas Benson that built the Benson-Hammond House is 6 generations forward from that Thomas. And he is actually my 3rd cousin, 6 times removed. And as it says here, he purchased about 7.5 acres of land in 1807, and he and his wife, Nancy Smith. I recently have been told and saw documented that he bought it from Nancy's father, Basil Smith. Now, I just last week got another piece of paper in inheritance say that he bought land from John Giles Cromwell, but I believe that was a few years later, because we do have documentation for both of those. And he did acquire land over time. So they built a log cabin. They had 4 children, 2 daughters, Anne and Elizabeth. Elizabeth went by Betty, and then the sons Basil and Joseph. So sadly, Nancy died in 1814, right after Joseph died, and really unusually, he never remarried. So in 1820, he began the construction of a 4-room home that would become what is known today as the Benson-Hammond House. So as you all probably know very well, Adam Shipley, originally from Yorkshire, England, came here in 1668. So his impact on our county has blossomed into a legacy of many properties that carry his name today. Shipley's Choice and Shipley's Homestead, which is a new development right across from where I live, to name just two. And many of you carry along with that bloodline the spirit of the type of exceptional man that leaves his home to explore a new country. So while I'm only distantly related, I'm proud to claim that Adam is my 7th cousin, 9 times removed, by way of this very same Benson line. So we have deep roots in Anne Arundel County. By the way, not to name drop, but hey, why not? Lady Anne Arundel, which is how her name was pronounced, is my 7th cousin, 10 times removed. So we know that you're related to early Maryland families, that you generally can't throw a rock without hitting another relative distant or close. And as I mentioned at one meeting, there was a project they were trying to do with particular surname, and they had a list of all the related ones. And Connie and I were sitting and going, yes, yes, no, yes, 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 no. And we were probably about 11 or 12 of the families that we were both related to, which was great. So each level of socioeconomic group married within their sphere. The wealthy marrying other wealthy people to keep the land, titles, and money together, such as my Dorsey and Ridgely ancestors, and Heather's, we found out, who owned Hampton Mansion and Hockley in the Hole. And like my 7th great-grandfather, Caleb Dorsey Sr., who married Eleanor Warfield of All Hallows Parish, these families owned the local ironworks, hence controlling the local industry and in turn securing their standing in the community. Similarly, this was reflected in the smaller family farms, who often just simply married their neighbors out of convenience and proximity. And I always wondered how many budding romances began at a Sunday ice cream social at the old Friendship Methodist Church. Now, as many of you might know, the church was taken down to build the airport, which was BWI, which was originally named Friendship Airport. So as I mentioned earlier, the builder of the house, Thomas, purchased a little over 7.5 acres of land in about 1807 and built a log cabin. His wife, Nancy Smith, was from nearby, and they had the 4 children, as I mentioned. She died in 1814, and since he never remarried, so many of the families would have second and maybe sometimes even third wives, we assume that because he did have some enslaved people on the farm, it was really just a sad reality of the time, that someone must have been a wet nurse to raise his children. And later, after just a few years later, he began the construction of the Benson's larger home, which originally was just 4 rooms, the parlor, the dining room, with a main hall with front and back doors for cross ventilation, and the 2 bedrooms upstairs. And his enslaved people that lived there then moved into the log cabin. On that topic, Thomas was not a holder of many slaves, as others in the area unfortunately were. He even had free people of color engaged in working his land. And we have a record of him freeing the one son of the woman that we believe raised his children after Nancy's death upon that son's 18th birthday. And I must admit, I do sometimes wonder, since we've just found the record of this one man, if he may possibly have been related to the family for him to have freed him, but I have no evidence one way or another, just speculation. But a look into the family's relationships with people of color who were in their lives comes from a story of one such person. John Henry Robinson was born into slavery on the 21st of November, 1844, and worked as a houseboy for Basil Smith Benson at his estate, Lockwood's Adventure. His mother, Henrietta, was a cook and a wet nurse. Her other children were Horace the baby, Margaret, and Thomas Mordecai. John Henry was emancipated by Basil at the age of 21, and he also worked for Basil's brother-in-law, Van Buren Smith, and for Thomas Colt, another farmer in the area. John Henry married Della Queen, a former slave in the Linthicum household, who was a house girl to Sweetser Linthicum. Basil's oldest son, George Milton Benson, actually loaned John Henry money to purchase land on the Baltimore County side of the Patapsco River near the bridge into Lansdowne, and John Henry became a successful farmer. He and Della raised 2 sons and 2 daughters, Beulah, Ferdinand, Ethel, and Oscar, and he died the 22nd of January in 1931. Now this story was relayed by Dorothy Benson Keene, who was the daughter of Joseph Jones Benson, the youngest son of Basil, and she referred to them as Aunt Della and Uncle John. So daughters Anne and Elizabeth, who later married cousins Charles Van Buren Smith and John William Smith, and sons Basil and Joseph, who married the Kelly sisters, Margaret and Mary Susanna, followed the custom of marrying neighbors from nearby farms. So Basil remarried after Margaret Kelly died to Mary Smith, who we can only assume is related in some capacity since his mother was a Smith. As while I researched her parentage via the Smith and the Hawkins lines, I've yet to discern their exact blood relationship. But when Nancy's father died, he left his farmland to the sons, which expanded the Benson family holdings. Along with other purchases over the year, their property grew. So Basil built his house, that's a photo of his house, on his maternal grandfather's former land, and you can find this house still standing on Nursery Road right next to the Cracker Barrel restaurant. It's kind of hidden behind trees and it is privately owned. So you kind of got to go around to the back of the parking lot and look for it. Basil had 2 children with Margaret and then added 14 more with Mary. Sadly, 4 died in infancy. Okay. Just before Thomas's death in 1860, his son Joseph and his wife Mary Susanna took over legal ownership of the house. She was a real trooper. She gave birth to 15 children, 3 of whom tragically died before their first birthdays. So raising 12 children in a 4-room house just isn't feasible. So Joseph is who added on to the house. He added a 3rd, which is actually a half story, and an extension at one end. At one time, there was a porch on the back of the house, but it was later removed, and now the present-day home has a porch along the front. We know that Basil and second wife Mary's son, now how this for a good name, Summerfield Philander Hamilton Benson, married Laura Jane Shipley, daughter of George Edward Shipley, son of Larkin Shipley, and Mary Jane Harmon. Laura and Summerfield's portraits are on display in the parlor of the Benson-Hammond House. There are actually different images from these photos that I have found through other research. So speaking of portraits, as was mentioned earlier, we have the actual portraits of Larkin, and I have her marked as Mary Jane. You had a different name for her, but we have her noted as Mary Jane Harmon. Do you guys know where they're buried, where Larkin is buried? It's in Hanover, in the area near Rundle, not too far from the Rundle Mills Mall, also on Ridge Road. And my house is actually not really too far from that particular cemetery. All right, in the adult bedroom, in the 2nd floor, we have the wedding dress of another of my cousins, 4th cousin, 2 times removed, Iantha Martha Cromwell, and she married, shown here, John Wilson Shipley on the 20th of December in 1888. We have their wedding invitation on display, as well as the announcement that I was able to find from an old newspaper. And he was the son of John William Shipley and Mary Elizabeth Kircher. Anybody know if they're related to that group? So recently we were gifted, as Connie mentioned, a collection of photos. It's about 70 photos of many people that are related. And some of the children noted, some portraits we have, are their children. We have Randolph Wilson Shipley, Mary Lillian Shipley, and Beulah Benson Shipley. And both sisters actually later married men from the Clark family. Anybody know any of these folks? Okay, another connection I personally have in my family tree is through my Pindell line, which I mentioned. We were talking about, I was having a hard time getting into the DAR. You have to prove relationships. The church records from Hartford Baptist Church were gone. My cousin and I were just calling all over trying to find the archives. If you go there, it says records unavailable, records lost. There was a person from the church who was supposed to have the care of those records as genealogist. You know how frustrating that can be. And I called and I said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I understand." And she said, "I don't do that anymore," and hung up the phone. So I said, "Well, that's a dead end." But I was able to actually find court documentation of a case for an inheritance. And I've got the printout here of the actual records, and it proves the parentage, who the children were, who they were married to for a couple generations, and the DAR accepted it to be able to close that door. So we have covered the marriages and relationships of the Bensons to the Shipleys. Let us not ignore the very important connection of the Shipleys to the Hammonds. Brothers John Thomas and Resin Howard Hammond purchased the house from Joseph's widow 5 years after his death in 1887. He had been ill for a period of time prior to passing away and requested her to sell the by now very significant farm to pay their debts. Resin was married to a Benson cousin and an extremely successful farmer himself, so he was a logical choice to buy the family farm, and he would have had the wealth to make such a significant purchase, thereby relieving Mary Susanna of the burden of running the farm. So who are Resin and John Thomas's parents, you might wonder? Well, actually, this is his father, John Thomas, who's married to none other than Campsidell Shipley.
That's a Shipley, Campsidell.
Campsidell. Are there others? There's a daughter. She had a daughter. Yes.
My grandmother was Campsidell, Arnold.
Oh, cool. Good name, good name. Okay.
My great.
So I was thrilled to get a call this summer to accept 2 portraits from a member of the extended Benson family, and upon researching, discovered that in fact the parents of John Thomas Hammond, so were the in-laws of Campsidell Shipley, and we're having them repaired after some unfortunate water damage. He had them stored in his basement, and he had a flood, so the bottom of the pictures are a little mildewed, these portraits, and I hope to put them on display at a future time. They're about twice as big as these that we have here, so they're big, heavy things, so we're working on that. So again, mentioning the photos donated last Christmas, so many of them are unnamed, and we have, the ones I do have named, I'm trying because of duplications of names, I just want to make sure I have them in the right family structure. So some of those who are being identified and hopefully put into their family place eventually are Irving Shipley, the gentleman upper left there, a handsome man with dark eyes, very different from the very light eyes of Violet Shipley, seen here as a young woman. I have Carl Hawkins Shipley on the end with his sister, but it doesn't have her name. If anybody knows who that is, we'd like to identify her. Also, Hazel Gertrude Shipley and Virgie Shipley. How precious is it to have these baby pictures of these family members? Okay, next. Howard Shipley, Will Shipley, Emma Shipley. Are any of these people in your line? Do you know any of them? The one here on this side didn't have a name on it, and I had a couple pictures of Howard. He looks like Howard, but his nose is a little smaller, and his face is shaped a little differently, so I don't know if he's a brother or a cousin, but photo from the same era. So Pumphrey, Cromwell, Phelps, Ryder, Harmon, Benson, Hammond, Yeatle, Hawkins, and Shipley. All of these names of area farmers, business people, local politicians, judges, postmasters, those who built our county into what it has become. I want to end on a story discovered a few years ago, and it touches my heart as it looks back into a time not so long ago, but very different from now. Of course, things changed greatly after the war between the states and emancipation, and the farm workers were by then primarily immigrants from Germany, Poland, and Bohemia. Here's a perspective from one who witnessed that amazing time in history. It's titled, My Girlhood Home and Farm by Arminella Hammond Schreiner. Arminella's brother was William Shipley Hammond Sr., 1866 to 1924, who married Lillian Cromwell Hammond, sister of Cedric Thomas Cromwell, whose picker checks I'm wearing for earrings. And they were the daughter of Richard T. Cromwell and Eveline Phelps Cromwell, whose farm was right next door to that Hammond farm. And she writes, "My great-grandmother's memories of a trip to her girlhood home just outside of Baltimore with her daughter, either my grandmother, Stella Schreiner Ivy, or my great-aunt Louisa Margaret Schreiner. It was probably the latter. I don't remember Grandma Ivy ever driving, but I do remember Aunt Louise driving, an old Plymouth. I think from the text, I gather that the trip took place during World War II. Working from a Xerox of the handwritten manuscript, which is who knows where, I transcribed the text as literally as I could. The cursive script was hard to read in places. Words that I couldn't make out have a question mark next to them. The spelling is as it is in the manuscript. Punctuation I interpreted as best I could. Periods looked like comma and vice versa. The paragraph breaks were inserted by me for readability. Bold-faced text was underlined in the manuscript, and the notes at the bottom were written on the back of the Xerox manuscript by my mother, Jean Ivy Measday. A historian named John Greenstreet provided further information, including a photograph. And on the opposite side, that is their home, Snow Hill. Very, very old photograph, the only one that I've found that exists. So here is her mother's story in a lovely, lovely vernacular country way that she wrote it. I had a great longing to see my girlhood home and farm, so my daughter and I hopped in the machine one Sunday afternoon and were soon on our way. It isn't so far, about 10 miles away as the crow flies. I had not been there for about 3 years, but lots of changes can take place in a short time. We left the Annapolis Boulevard, turned in our lane, to which we sort of laid claim, and as we came nearer, there stood the dear old home, where they had been much fun and frolic in our childhood days. Yes, standing on the high hill as a sentinel keeping watch, all quiet except for a caretaker and his wife. A very large 3-story red brick house with many rooms and porches, for that house had been lived in by father and mother, 7 sons and 4 daughters, but more of them later. There was 1,000 acres of land, all tilled for many, many years. My grandfather built the house for my parents when they were first married, which would make the home about 80 or 81 years old. Also gave them 40 acres of land. The rest of the 1,000 he accumulated himself. The house only had 2 stories when first built, but the family grew, so father added the 3rd story. Father's ancestors, the Hammonds, came from England in the year of 1634. Mother's people came later, the Shipleys. Father was a wonderful farmer, the best in his day. I do not remember him ever doing any work himself, but a wonderful executive. He was up at 4 o'clock in the morning, in bed by 8, never reproved us for the noise we made, and there was plenty. The things he grew were strawberries, peas, beans, tomatoes, blackberries, red and black raspberries, cantaloupes, peaches, apples, cherries, gooseberries, grapes, all grains such as wheat, corn, hay, and oats. We, the children, used to look forward to the times when help had to come save the crops. We had what we called a row boss, a man that spoke the Bohemian and Polish language and murdered the English language. He was hired to go to the homes of these people and engage them to pick the fruits for market and to be shipped away. The time was usually about the latter part of May that they arrived. There were about 200 men, women, and children that came. Our wagons would go into the city about 4 o'clock in the morning, load up household things, feather beds, cooking utensils, food, clothes, but no furniture. They had plenty of trunks, the kind that came from overseas. They would arrive about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon to live in long shanties, built on the barracks kind that our soldiers live in. Only they did not have the upstairs. Well, one of them did. They were built in a grove of lovely trees. A nearby brook ran through the edge. and there was a wonderful spring that could not be dipped dry that supplied the water for these folks. And did they love it, for it was very icy and pure. We kids always welcomed them on their arrival, for it meant lots of life on the old farm. It did not take them long for them to get settled. They made up their bunks on the floor. Each family staked off his corner. In a little while, you could see campfires glowing. They fixed ovens and built baths out of boards near the fire. They were all pale and thin, being shut up in the city. But when they left to go back, you could have seen when they left, their cheeks were rosy, their bodies were filled out after having all the fruit and vegetables and fresh air, and they were happy. They went in the fields just as soon as they could see to pick the crops. Some mornings they were through by 11 o'clock. When crops were heavy, they worked all day. Then when we looked towards the shanties late in the evening, you could see the figures passing around in the fire, like getting their evening meal. They were all musical, playing the accordion, singing and dancing after working all day was a sight one never forgets as the time passes. The price of picking strawberries, 1.5 cents per quart. Raspberries, 2 cents a quart. Peas, 15 cents a bushel. Beans, 20 cents a bushel. Blackberries, 1 cent a quart. This may sound like very little in comparison to today's prices, but your money had more value in those days. When you shipped off your stuff to Pittsburgh and other places, your boxes and crates were returned, for they had your names stenciled on them. Then they passed a law, no crates and baskets to be returned. I remember Father saying at the time, "Manuel, let's not plant berries, for there is no money made when you have to give away the containers." Now on the help on the farm to plant, sow, and plow, we had 5 tenement houses on the farm, with the white families living in 2 of them, Negro families in the other 3. Also a large log cabin quarter with the Negro men that came from Virginia stayed. From June until just a few weeks before Christmas, when they went back to their families in Virginia to carry their spoils of the season, the Negroes did not migrate to the north then as they do now. They said it was too cold. I think we had about 30 mules and 8 driving horses, and if you wanted to see a sight, you should have seen those animals when around the drinking troughs. The 2 Negroes pumped the water into the troughs. Then when the stock had their fill, wending their way back to the barn and the stables, looking like a trail against the skyline to get their nice meal of corn and hay, you would just not take anything for the memories. Among other things, we had a beautiful white Angora goat, and did we love that animal. Father had a wagon built and harness made, so we could hitch Billy to the wagon, and just about 4 of us could squeeze in to ride. Billy would do fine until he grew tired, and then he would refuse to pull. After working on him a while, we would give up, unhitch, and start for the house. Billy was very vengeful, would start too, and woe is he who got in his path. The next thing he would put his head down, make a run, and you would just be knocked out and not in the boxing ring. Each one received the same treatment if he was not on alert. Could that goat butt? Then one day, Billy picked up a hickory nut, swallowed it, and choked, and before we could help, he died. Poor Billy. I can still see him in my mind's eye as he would saunter towards the clothesline, and before you could arm yourself, he had the sleeve or leg chewed off of some of the family's wash, and the clothes were crippled for life. We all sat around, 6 mourners, all crying for Billy's untimely death. There was a large funeral in the apple orchard where we laid him to rest amid the apple blossoms. Now there were no schools near, so Father and Mother had a governess for us. There were quite a few children from the Cromwell family, also from the Stoll family. Our house was large, so there was a schoolroom. The doors were open to our neighbors' children. Of course, the older children were taught, sent away to colleges, then the next group were taught, sent away, until there were no more, for we were all grown up. It takes a lot of teaching and learning for a family of 11. There was always a lot of help. The servants were not a problem of those days. I don't think my parents could have accomplished so much if there had been. But there was a school built nearby after all time. I remember one year we started to the public school, but it did not pan out well. We had to be taken in bad weather and sent for. And when the weather was good, we loitered. It was most night when we returned home. One day, John and Herbert hung back alone. They had to come across a meadow where the hay had been cut and stacked. And they rested. And the boys thought they would lean against the stack a while. It was the spring of the year and a little cool. One of them said, "Gee, let's warm our hands." A match was lighted. Immediately, the stack caught fire. The workmen were plowing nearby. Father, who was on the hill, saw the smoke, called to the plowmen to hurry over and plow around the other stacks and save them, which they did. Could you have seen the expression on my brothers' faces, fright and tears? Then they said to Father, "Oh, look what one little match can do." That saying was never forgotten, and that ended public school. So we had always had good cooks. 3 of them were men, one of them really only 17 years of age. He surely could make buckwheat cakes. After the family had eaten, he would always cook a stack of them for himself with homemade sausage. One morning, my little sister Stella was passing through the kitchen just as William sat down to his breakfast. Sister, like all kids, commenced to count the cakes. Mother was in the dining room, and William said, "Miss Campsey, care how many hot cakes I eat. Miss Stella is counting the cakes on me." "No, William, eat as many as you want." But there were so many things that come in a large family. We could all ride and hitch up a horse, though we had someone to do it for us. We were taught a lot of things that we rebelled at learning, but they, Mother and Father, knew best. We were allowed all the company we wanted, providing we picked the right kind. I remember one incident where there were 4 girls that came with us from school. How we were catered to. But we had everything that could make a family happy. My parents were always just in their judgments and decisions. They were just grand. There was lots of fun where there is a large family. They amuse each other and take care of one another. I could go on indefinitely, but I must move on if we are to see the farm, and that is one of the things my daughter and I started to do. But my mind sidetracked with memories. There's a steep road that leads up to our home from our lane. Well, the government has bought a strip off of the home place at the foot of this road, going on past the farm, down through the camp. The camp is 500 acres taken from the home farm by the government in the First World War, and it is called Curtis Bay Ordnance Camp, and lays on the same creek that passes the farm. They had barracks and magazines where the high explosives were stored during World War I, then moved after the war. Well, now that World War II is on, that same camp has many more barracks and is being used, but they don't look much like our old hunting days. Adjoining the home camp, I will call it, my sister lives. The place years back belonged to one of my ancestors, Charles Hammond. The old brick house that sister lives in is supposed to have bricks that were formerly used in ships for ballast that traveled to and from England. There was quite a bit of land there, but the oil people that handle oil have taken it. Standard, Sinclair, and such firms have bought up all the land until about only 30 acres are left. Then down across Cabin Branch Bridge, you come to the Coast Guard. All that property belonged to neighbors, the Watsons. Retracing our steps back over the bridge through Curtis Bay, we come to the Fairfield shipbuilding yards. All that property at time belonged to uncles, the Crisps. Old homes gone, industry taking the old farms. Through Brooklyn, past the MP church, the ground under it being a gift of my grandfather, back home, feeling like these things happened long, long ago. So again, told by Arminella Hammond Schreiner, the daughter of Campsdale Lucinda Shipley, born in 1842, and John Thomas Hammond. The whole place was called Snow Hill. So to sum up, in a will, witnessed September 11, 1777, Colonel Charles Hammond stated, "I give and devise unto my dear wife Rebecca Hammond the use of a tract of land called Jackson's Chance. Then in 1854, the same tract of land was deeded to the Patapsco Land Company. A deed dated 1861 shows that the property was purchased from the Patapsco Land Company by Daniel Stoll, who had come to this country from Germany in the early 1800s, and it was to remain in the Stoll family for 4 generations. On February 20th, 1901, the 3rd generation of Stolls, John Daniel Stoll, married Stella G. Hammond, a direct descendant of that first Colonel Charles Hammond. So in 1969, in the name of progress, the State Roads Commission acquired the property from the 4th generation of Stolls to complete the Outer Harbor Beltway. And in the spring of 1971, the house fell victim to the bulldozers, and a 60-foot excavation replaced a cherished landmark with ribbons of concrete. How different our county looks today. Those early families who built something special are remembered in the stories told and shared, something that we, the descendants of those people who are still here, know the value of. Never stop sharing where we come from, and they will never be forgotten. So thank you.